On 60 acres of plush Maryland landscape, Cellar House Plantation is the very picture of American pastoralism. In a world away from the chaotic rush of the country's metropolises, the life that teems around the old Cellar House is mostly local fauna. There, one is more likely to spot a bounding deer, creeping woodland vole, or darting hare than an American citizen. Cellar House sits on a ridge overlooking the Pocomoke River, about a mile south of Milborn Landing State Park. The stately 18th century home was purchased by a Salisbury architect named John Graham in the 1960s and has been a home for the Graham family ever since. Mr. Graham knew that he wasn't purchasing a typical real estate when he bought the Cellar House estate. The site of one of Maryland's most infamous murders, the house on the river is surrounded by gore and mystery. It is the focal point of one of the state's most enduring folktales, a story that features nuptial infidelity, a family torn asunder, and a violent crime of homicidal passion. Cellar House dates back to the 1740s, but it rests on foundations that go back further than that, to a 1666 land grant bestowed on a French sea captain by Lord Baltimore. This French captain built the house on the Pocomoke shortly after he took a bride, furnishing the home with luxuries that were rarely found on the austere East Coast settlements of the time. We have no way of knowing how well the couple got along, but it is said that the captain soon came under financial difficulty and began smuggling illegal goods as a way to make ends meet. He dug a secret tunnel from the river's edge to the cellar of his home, where he would store all the contraband he smuggled in from abroad. Rumors began to spread about the wealth in the captain's cellar, and locals were soon referring to the place as Cellar House, whispering about the untold wealth that was stored underneath the captain's home. To this day, some people believe there may be treasures buried somewhere on Cellar House Plantation, an inheritance that no descendants lived long enough to claim for their own. For despite the massive wealth the captain was said to amass in his cellar, his family would become legendary in its violent demise. Sailing great distances, the captain was absent from home for long stretches of time, leaving behind a lonely wife who often spent months in isolation. Desperate for company, the young woman eventually took notice of a seafarer who sailed his vessel up and down the Pocomoke regularly. Their relationship began innocently, with the young sailor stopping off at the wharf for dinner, but their loneliness was a potent catalyst to their mutual attraction, and it wasn't long before the two were embroidered in an adulterous affair. They managed to keep it from the French seamen for quite some time, even after the woman gave birth to a child that she believed was fathered by her lover rather than her husband, but her devious arrangement did not last forever. The ill-fated evening was a moonless one when the French sea captain, weary from months of travel on the stormy Atlantic, pivoted his ship up the Pocomoke only to see that another ship was docked at the wharf. All of his worst suspicions were confirmed when the captain stormed into his bedchamber to find his wife under the sheets with another man. The woman's paramour had just managed to get out of the house with his life that night, but the unfortunate woman would never greet another dawn with a smile. After suffering a terrible beating at the hands of her husband, she, along with her infant, was banished from the house. But the dishonored woman had nowhere to go, and no means to provide even the most basic shelter. Days later, with a starving child in her arms and despair at her heart, the estranged woman turned her eyes back to her husband's door, hoping to win forgiveness. Disaster struck before she even reached home. It was a stormy night when the woman began her journey back to Cellar House, and the vessel she was in overturned in the Pocomoke's rushing waters. She lost her child in her frantic swim to the river's edge. The screams of her terrified, drowning infant were ringing in her ears as she trudged through the surrounding swampland, so that the grief-ridden woman was half mad by the time she showed up at Cellar House's front door. But the Frenchman, having spent weeks festering in a drunken melee, was nowhere near a state of forgiveness, and when the source of his misery showed up on his doorstep, he flew into a murderous rage. Dragging the poor woman up to the same room where he had witnessed her tryst, he ended her tortured life with a knife in the chest, leaving her to die on the bedroom floor. It is said that the Frenchman set sails to his ship that night and floated down the Pocomoke to the Atlantic Ocean, never to return to Maryland again. The woman's body was discovered weeks later, rotting on the bedroom floor where she had fallen. Cellar House was left unoccupied for years, as the weeds on the grounds grew as tall as the tales about the tragic events that had transpired during the building's first years. There is good reason the story stayed alive. On stormy summer nights, locals have heard eerie sounds coming from the river. Amid torrential rain and crashing thunder, the fragile wail of a terrified child travels on the wind, waking some of the people who live on the banks of the Pocomoke. Those in deep slumber often sleep through the child's timid cries, only to be woken by the horrible scream that is said to always follow. This cry is a spine-tingling sound, tortured and prolonged, drifting in from the darkness of the blustering night. Others have heard strange sounds from Cellar House itself. The fearful cries of a desperate woman in mortal danger, the roaring response of a man possessed by terrible intentions. These occurrences have been repeatedly documented over succeeding generations, with neighbors, campers, and boaters reporting bizarre sounds coming from Cellar House at odd hours. While such accounts have secured Cellar House's place in Maryland's tome of supernatural folklore, residents of the old home have surprisingly been able to enjoy the bucolic luxury of Cellar House Plantation. Though it has been left deserted for decades at a time during its history, affluent Marylanders have always come back to the house on the Pocomoke. In 1966, John Graham found disturbing evidence that there might be something behind the legends, for while he was supervising the renovations to the old house, his crew unearthed the skeleton of the house cellar, buried in the dirt ground of the 300-year-old subterranean storage room. Fearing that it might be the remains of the adulterous woman, Mr. Graham had two archaeologists study the corpse. The archaeologists weren't absolutely certain, but they believed that the skeleton actually was that of an American Indian. Further study of the site suggested that Cellar House might have been built atop an ancient Indian burial ground. This was not comforting news for John Graham, who was growing attached to the house he had just purchased. Yet years have passed, and the Graham family still lives in the historic home, enjoying the splendid comfort and scenery of rural Maryland. Perhaps the ghosts of Cellar House have finally resolved their age-old marital dispute and abandoned their earthly grievances for a peaceful oblivion. Perhaps they have been inspired by the show of general familial content that the Grahams have brought to the area and are no longer locked in their destructive vortex of rage and desperation. Or maybe they simply lie dormant, waiting for an unknown signal to bring them back. It may simply be a matter of time before the horrifying nocturnal howls drift over the Pocomoke's banks once again, terrorizing those who reside in the peaceful plantation.